All right, welcome again to the second session on May 1st of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee's National Online Conference, and happy May Day. We have a panel today of people in our own network that have some wisdom to share, and we wanted to highlight their voices this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're at. In this session, we're featuring 3 younger war tax resistors who are involved in different aspects of organizing. They'll share their own stories and ideas for inviting younger activists into war tax resistance. So currently, the order of our panel for today, we're going to start off with Lindsey Britt, then Jerry Maynard, and then Al McGillivray. And Lindsey Britt is a nonprofit administrator, traveler, and amateur ethicist whose activist work is focused in climate justice and animal rights movements. She's also been helping NWTRCC with fundraising and is one of our nominees for the administrative committee when we have our business meeting tomorrow. Second will be Jerry Maynard. Jerry's also known as the People's Priest. He is a spiritual renegade and social revolutionary with a ministry of protest, praise, and community organizing in Houston, Texas. A leader in a variety of movements, Jerry teaches the spirituality of nonviolence, works on foreign and domestic issues, and serves as the founding pastor of the People's Church, an online community of sacred activists from a variety of spiritual traditions. He is also currently serving as one of NWTRCC's administrative committee members. Then Al McGillivray is a war tax resistor in the Pacific Northwest and is active in mutual aid and abolitionist efforts in her area. She learned about war tax resistance from faith-based anti-war and anti-nuclear activists. She engages in resistance in many aspects of her life, including music, doula work, facilitation, intentional relationship, simple living, and riding her bike. So we'll again start off with Lindsay. So I will put the video focus on her and hand it over to Lindsay.
Hi, as Lincoln was saying, my name is Lindsey Britt. I grew up in Western Mass, which is a pretty progressive area of the country. I attended Fordham University, where I got a degree in political science, focusing on political economy, and a certificate in peace and justice studies. And I think that was one of the places where I kind of got my start down this path. After college, I went into nonprofit development, including grant writing, and then went back to school for a graduate certificate in community environmental studies and a master's in regional planning. And after working several years in government, being different types of a bureaucrat, I returned to nonprofit management and development. So when not working, I like to bank, volunteer for Meals on Wheels, coordinate tree plantings with 350 Vermont, and read. And I hope that one day, not too far in the future, I'll be able to finish climbing all of the 4,000 footers in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, which is a project I started with my dad when I was a kid. And I just mentioned all of that to provide context. Now I'm going to share my screen and share what I came up with when Lincoln asked me to think about this project. So bear with me while I do that. Okay, I'm hoping, Lincoln, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay, great. Okay, so I resist oppressive and violent systems in a number of ways. I think of tax resistance as one of the tools that I use in that resistance. I named the little toolbox on your screen resistance, but I think I could also rename it peacefulness and say that redirecting my tax dollars to peace and justice causes is a tool that I use in creating a more peaceful world. And it was actually, now that I think about it, when I learned about the redirecting, that kind of made me even more interested in tax resistance, because having the background in nonprofit management and in particular fundraising, um, those were things that I always enjoyed doing, and I love giving away money. I think that's a really fun thing to do. So that excited me about tax resistance, being able to redirect it. So I came to tax resistance by way of other movements. I've been involved in electoral politics. I spent a lot of time working on climate justice issues. These pictures show me dressed up as a sweet pea costume for the 2017 climate march in Washington, D.C., tabling with 350 Philadelphia to support fossil fuel-free public transportation. As a college student, I marched in New York City against World Trade Organization policies. And because my studies were focused on political economy, I spent a lot of time thinking about the connection between capitalism and oppression. And it was definitely some of my teachers at Fordham University that really got me thinking about those things. And I've carried that forward with me since. So I care about war. Obviously, I care deeply about nonviolence and therefore obviously abhor the concept of war, but I don't know anyone who has been drafted. And I only have one distant relative who has served in the military during my lifetime. Um, and also, once I realized how enormous the military budget was, I found it kind of daunting. So if war tax resistance couldn't be related to other things I care about, like climate justice and animal rights and things, then I'm not sure that just opposing war would have been enough for me to adopt tax resistance. What motivated me to resist war taxes was the interconnection between those issues that mattered to me and our tax dollars, wanting to live my values, which I think is a really common refrain amongst people of my generation, and the ability to use resistance against those taxes as an everyday tool against oppression. Um, as I mentioned at the beginning, I work a lot in animal rights activism. And so, like, my practice of being vegan is like an everyday tool I use that reminds me to work against oppression. And I think of tax resistance in a similar way, because I may not work exactly every day, not work quite as much as I probably eat, but I do it frequently. And so when I work, I'm reminded of this resistance that I have and how I'm practicing. So some ideas for attracting younger resistors. This was something that we were asked to think about for this panel. And I think that New Tricks should focus on helping younger people see war tax resistance as a tool they can use in expressing their resistance to oppressive systems and in creating a better world through the redirection of their dollars. Resisting can be tough, but highlighting the joy of redirecting money, or at least not contributing to the oppressive system, I think could be really appealing to a lot of younger folks. I think it's important to show people that there are rewards, because resistance could just be seen as drudgery. I know that I've not been doing this for very long, but I've found it to be difficult. It can be hard to make the commitment. It can be hard from just an accounting standpoint to figure out what you're doing. And because it's something that a lot of the time feels like you're doing it alone, that can feel a little bit more like drudgery and just this difficult thing that you're doing by yourself. Whereas, for example, when I do my climate justice work, I'm often gathering with other people. We're planning our single day event and action. And it may be part of an ongoing campaign, which tax resistance is kind of an ongoing campaign, but with like those climate justice things, it feels very centered and communal. Um, and so I also think that building bridges with other social justice organizations could be helpful in showing people another tool they can use to advance their goals, like disarming police officers, for example, and express their values. A lot of younger people I don't think are aware of this as a possible tool. And I think once they learn more about it, it's intriguing to people, that it's something they could do every day, to show, their belief in certain things. I'd also love to see Newtrick connect the dots to the issues that young people care about, because I don't think we can assume people will make those connections on their own. And to me, war tax resistance, like I just said, is a great intersectional tool, but I don't think it's widely known. And I think it's really important to let people know how they can start resisting, even if they have student debt. Um, and one way to do that, to get people interested, is maybe taking the next step and explaining how our war spending makes for higher education less affordable. Um, it's important to let young people who may have a lot of student debt know that they can get involved today. Um, if they're upset about student debt, then pointing out the connection between student debt and war spending could be helpful. Also, having a pamphlet, which Newtrick does such a great job of creating, about student debt and war tax resistance could be useful. Like, I've finished paying off my student loans before I got involved with this, so I don't know what the connections are, but I can imagine people having questions about, well, if I refuse to pay some portion of my taxes, what is that going to do with my student loans? Or is something going to happen related to that? How, being concerned about that. I think it's also really important to show people that they can start small by being an ally, writing letters, refusing to pay just a small amount. To me, tax resistance is a muscle we build, and starting small makes a lot of sense. You wouldn't start off benching 100 pounds, and you don't have to start by resisting all of your income taxes either. Over the long run, I think it's healthier for most people to build up their strength, and they'll be more likely to continue the practice over the long haul if they're better prepared and ease their way in. Um, an example I use is that when I was in high school, I stopped eating meat except for fish. Then later on, I moved to being vegetarian, and now I'm vegan. I eased my way in, and now I can't imagine doing anything else. I would be very unlikely to go back. Um, Another example is that when I started doing nonviolent direct action, I did big group activities like marches, which in the early 2000s weren't likely to draw a lot of attention from police. The situation has changed a little bit now, but um, then so I participated in those marches. Then I participated in classes to learn more about different tactics, and then I risked arrest with groups I trusted. So I worked my way up to greater risk. I didn't just jump in. And for me, that worked well. So my kind of final 2 cents is that um, I'm not sure that resisting war is motivating enough for young people. I think you have to frame it as supporting justice and peace through refusal to pay income taxes. Um, I think the relationship of people my age and younger to the concept of war is maybe different than it was for previous generations when perhaps there was a draft. Um, I think letting them know that there's a highly supportive and active network of folks ready to help them use their tax resistance to meet their goals for a better world is really important. And when I started thinking about this, I was wondering, like, what about phrases like climate crisis tax resistance or racial injustice tax resistance? Like, how we frame this resistance for different people and letting them know that their concerns fall under the umbrella of war tax resistance, making those connections. Um, and I really think strongly that building solidarity with other movements would be really valuable, whether it's co-sponsoring events that are happening like active bystander trainings or other activities, but just showing that people who are involved in war tax resistance are there and supporting these movements and that there is that intersection. And then another idea I had was creating opportunities for people to engage with NWTRC that aren't directly tied to war tax resistance. So building that relationship and trust. For example, like if you have a book that's about peace and you have a book group that talks about that, like that is a concept that's related to NWTRC, but it's not necessarily tax resistance. And so people who might be interested in that topic would participate, and kind of find out maybe just in a very peripheral way about this group, and you're engaging with folks, letting them know that you're there and that these are issues you're interested in, and not necessarily worrying so much about sharing the message of tax resistance, because I think that can be scary to some folks. And so then lastly, I just wanted to share this quote. I really like this quote from Dennis Kucinich. Violence is not inevitable. War is not inevitable. Nonviolence and peace are inevitable. We can make of this world a gift of peace. We can send into the future the gift which will protect our children from fear, from harm, and from destruction. I think that message about the future and building the type of future we want really resonates with people who are younger. And that is all I had to share for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And yeah, thank you for sharing your experience, your ideas, and I'm already looking forward to our question and discussions afterwards. And so, but for the moment, I'll add the spotlight to Jerry Maynard. And then I'll bow out and I'll hand it over to Jerry.
Well, it's good to be with all of you. It's a joy and a blessing. I know many of you, and some of you I don't think I know, but I'm sure we will get to know each other eventually. And I want to begin first by acknowledging that this is stolen land. And so part of our resistance should always be to return this land to the original inhabitants of this land. This land that I currently live on in what we call Texas is the ancestral land of my people who hail from the Central Valley of Mexico, the Mexica people. And it is also the home of the Sana and the Comanche and many other native people. And if you know what land you are on and who it originally belonged to, you can put that into the chat. It's a good habit to learn that as a way of decolonizing your mind and also reminding yourself and other people that this is Turtle Island, not the United States. The two things I want to leave with you today, dear friends, is these two concepts that I think are important for myself and why I got involved in war tax resistance, but also I think it's important when we talk about witnessing to other folks about the power of tax resistance, whether it's for war or abolishing the police, abolishing the border patrol, and so on and so forth. The first one is simplicity. The word explain means to make plain, to make even, so that each of us is on the same level. And I think when we dare to live simply in our very complex world, it's very revolutionary because we are taught from the moment that we are born that we must constantly build and build and build. Build our reputation, build our ego, build our homes, build our bank accounts. And if we look at the witness of indigenous folks, not just of Turtle Island, but of other parts of the world, that's not the consciousness. The consciousness is living horizontally, living on the same plane, in collaboration with one another, living not as a separate entity in relation to the world, but living as part of the world, to the point to where there's no distinction between the two. And for me, that simplicity, that making things plain, was one of the main motivations for in 2013 when I decided to begin living as a war tax resistor. Part of that also too, as a Latino person, I was very aware that my culture teaches us that we're supposed to take care of each other. And that's why it's very uncommon for Latin families to not live together, to have multiple generations in one home, which is how my home is. And I think that wisdom that has been around for a long time is a sacred wisdom that can save us from going extinct, from going to destruction of the planet. Really abolishing this idea that we can get along without other people, when in reality, it took two people to create us. It took two people to create those two people, and two people to create those other two people. And by the time you do the math, we're in the thousands. So we are byproducts of thousands and thousands of people, many, many, many generations. So we are never alone, and therefore we should never act as if we are alone. We should build communities of simplicity, of horizontalness, of collaboration. So simply, living simply, that for me has taken on the form of choosing to live below the poverty line so that I don't have to worry about the taxable income and things like that. I remember once I was explaining this to someone that I didn't know really all that well. And I don't even remember how I came up actually. And they were like, well, why are you doing that? That makes you a burden to everybody else. And I laughed and I said, exactly, that's the point. You gotta learn that you can't get rid of me. You can't, that you and I are have to work together, that I'm not a commodity that can just be thrown out, and neither are you. We gotta lean on each other and lean into each other. I like to sometimes say, when I get invited to preach at congregations, that solidarity is all about learning to bend into each other. One of the 4 sacred medicines for Turtle Island for indigenous folks is called sweetgrass. And what's interesting about the teaching of sweetgrass is that it represents strength. And the reason why is because sweetgrass on its own is very fragile, and it breaks easily, and it easily is blown away in the wind. And that's why whenever it's used, it's braided into this long braid, because when it's braided, it's almost impossible to break it. And so like that, we need to be braided into each other, bent into each other, so that we learn to take care of one another. So yes, be a burden to people. And this also has taken the form, like Lindsay, for myself, of making the decision to live a plant-based lifestyle, holding compassion for the reality that I'm not always as disciplined about it as I probably could be, but knowing that that's better than the consumption of meat or dairy products. And the other element to this as well, dear friends, is that element of relationality. As I've already mentioned, we have to learn to bend into each other. But this also too, this relationality in the fact that I discovered in my discernment about doing this tactic, using this tactic in my daily life, that if I'm going to relate to my family and to my friends and to say that I care about them, you know, that's one thing, but that's kind of a given. Like, you should care about your family and you should care about your circle of friends. But it's much more difficult to care about people that you've never met before. And so if we're going to talk about like abolishing borders or abolishing war, then ultimately what we're talking about is we have to learn to be in right relationship with all people, including those that we don't know all that well. And that is much more of a challenge. And so that's why I think for me, it's important when I talk about war tax resistance, that I talk about it as a way of saying, I'm trying to protect my friends that I haven't met yet and my relatives that I haven't encountered yet. And so anyway, I'm sharing these ideas with you, which are much different than how Lindsay presented, because I want you to remember, again, making plain that ultimately, first and foremost, we are human beings. We are animal creatures that are able to walk and talk and have consciousness, although I do think that animals have a certain level of consciousness. But because of that, we have to learn to relate in such a way that our witness is disarming, what Martin Luther King called a disarmed truth. So that ultimately the beloved community actually can happen, which I do believe is possible. One of the ways that I think we can bring younger folks into the war tax resistant movement is recognizing these two elements of being honest and authentic with how we live, learning to live in at a means that is just and equitable as much as possible. We're always going to be compromised as long as we live in a capitalist system. So give yourself some grace and some space to breathe about that. But also this idea that I'm with you here on this plane. I may not completely understand what you're going through, but I'm willing to learn and I'm willing to show up for you. And I think Lindsay pointed out this reality in such a way about what we call tax resistance, whether it's war tax resistance or racial justice tax resistance, that this is an intersectional moment and this is an intersectional tactic. And so we don't need everybody to have the same lingo as us, as long as they're willing to dance with us in this revolution, right? Like Emma Goldman says, if I can't dance in your revolution, I don't want to be a part of it. That kind of reality. You know, this world is not a journey, it's really more a dance. And every once in a while, you got to learn to dance with different dance partners and to different rhythms. And so I think also too, not being afraid to talk about how can I say it? Not to be afraid to talk about the way that war is happening here at home. War is no longer an item that's all the way over there in a whole another country that most people can't find on the map. War is here at our border. War is here on our street. And there are people in this country who are victims of war every day, all day long. I'm thinking particularly of Indigenous people, Black and brown people, women, trans folks. And if we are going to be people of peace, of disarmament, then we have to actively disarm all of those wars that are happening here today, at this very moment, every second. And this way is a very unique and a direct way of challenging that system. Because if we take the power away by taking the money away, slowly but surely, the system will crumble. And maybe when it does crumble, we'll be able to use the bricks to create something more better, like a brick oven, or so we can make bread together. and eat together and build a table of fellowship together. And so anyway, those are my thoughts. Thank you for listening. I'm very proud of all of you. I hope you keep on keeping on doing whatever you're doing in the world. You're doing great. You're awesome. And many blessings to all of you.
All right, thank you, Jerry. Oops. All right, all right, yes. Thank you again, Jerry, for sharing your words of wisdom and giving us some things to think about as that we can speak to after our final speaker for this session today. So now I'll hand it over to Al.
Hey, I'm nervous. Thanks, Jerry, and thanks, Lindsay. And I really just want to say that I'm grateful for NWTRC and its members. And just that there's a community of people who are practicing this strategy, and empowering others. So I'm gonna speak in more detail about my own personal experience about being a war tax resister, sort of as like a case study, and then offer also some ideas. But I've been a war tax resister since 2007, since I graduated college. I joined the Catholic worker movement straight out of college. And so for folks who aren't familiar with that, it's essentially a decentralized group of Christian anarchists who believe that we don't need to rely on the government to create good and peace in the world, that we can meet people to person and provide for each other in a way that is compassionate and simple. So I moved in with a community of 20 people, helped run a soup kitchen. I didn't have to pay room and board, and I was making a whole $15 a week. So I was way under the poverty line. And I also had student debt that I was saddled with. And it was an incredible privilege to be able to receive donations from some folks attached to that Catholic worker community that could buoy me to not have to worry about that for the few years that I was living at the house. And I just want to acknowledge that's an incredible privilege that a lot of people don't have access to. And that allowed me to continue that resistance for the time that I was there. So I had heard that, like, oh, if you don't make any money, you don't have to file taxes. And I was like, great. So I guess I just won't do that. So I didn't do that for a few years. And in my memory, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation within the community about personal tax resistance, like income tax resistance, but there was a lot of conversation about the war machine, about US imperialism. And I really got imbued with a lot of knowledge and theological basis for the anti-war effort. Which was really different from my college experience, going to a Catholic college and having an ROTC program on the campus, and like there being a real tension between the students and even like among faculty and departments who were like teaching Catholic social teaching and liberation theology. And here we have the military present on our campus, but like coming to the Catholic worker movement and having just this very clear language around the theological imperative for peace and nonviolence was really formative for me. And just the whole time in general was really formative. We live simply in a way that people refer to as voluntary poverty, which I'm coming to think is a pretty problematic term, but is pretty representative of just the desired simplicity of the lifestyle that is really a counter to that bloated war and defense budget. And I was also introduced to the war tax resistance, that pie chart, that really, really helpful pie chart, and seeing all of the insidious ways that war is really woven in to the federal budget. It's not just the defense budget. I had no idea that there was money hidden away in the Department of Energy, and that's where the bomb was funded, you know, or that Veterans Affairs and things like that. It's everywhere, and I had no idea. And that illustration was really, really helpful for me. And so after I left the Catholic Worker, I traveled around a little bit and was able to visit with some other war tax resistors who I didn't really know were war tax resistors at the time, but got to stay with them and saw that they were living simple lives. They were mostly living under the poverty line, but they were also living like comfortably, you know, and that was really inspiring to me, because I had, you know, seen this model of like, let's all live together off of donations and sort of like cross our fingers that this keeps working. But there are people who had like intentionally set up their lives to maintain their resistance. And what was really most striking for me was like, they had secure housing, that they could do that, and they had a safe and stable place to live. And so that was really inspiring. And so I want to note that the folks that I had learned about war tax resistance from, the folks who had really introduced me to this practice, were mostly white and what I would say would be downwardly mobile, which is how I also would refer to myself like during this time, also like coming from a more privileged class, but not fully engaging in it, and also having that broader network of support from middle and upper class communities. And I think that that's really important to think about as we're trying to like broaden the movement and reach out to other people. Like as, and it's been talked about like the redistribution of wealth, which is also really central for me in being a war tax resistor. But I think it's really good to look at like, how are we supporting people who are taking that risk? And who can actually afford to take that risk, you know, who has the community that's going to support them, either through funds, through knowledge, through resources, and to continue to like willfully refuse income taxes. And what are we doing for the most marginalized of our war tax resistors, you know? Along this time, I found a partner who was like down with the cause, which is great. We moved out to the Midwest, and we're like, we're going to be war tax resistors now, like on our own. And he was like, he had a well-paying job, and we weren't married at the time, so he was over the poverty line, and I was under. And so I studied a lot. I tried to get all of the information I could, because it's terrifying to like really, you're kind of putting yourself out there. You're making yourself really vulnerable to the federal government by refusing. And there's so many different ways to resist. So I got some advice from experienced war tax resistors, and they either had like a lot less concerns than I did about the consequences of war tax resistance, or they couldn't like answer all of my very complex questions about withholdings, about W-4s, about dependents, about all of the bureaucracy of filing. And so somehow I got an old like workbook, an old text, and I think it was from the War Resistors League, literally I think from the 80s, like this like ancient text, and it had these like calculations in it, and so you could kind of like do the math of like to figure out your withholdings and how much you needed to, or how many withholdings would count for how much of your taxes being taken out or not taken out. And so my partner and I decided to claim like a certain number, which was about like half of the taxes. So like a symbolic sort of like, we're not paying half of our taxes because half of the taxes are going towards war. And even though like we'd made this choice like together, and I had like a live-in partner who was like, yes, we're going to do this, it was still so frightening. And everything just felt really unknown. So we did have like a little bit of knowledge, like we knew that our employers couldn't ask us about our withholdings. We knew that they weren't going to report it to the IRS unless it was like some really lofty number. And I think now like withholdings are different. And so like that's a whole other ball game. But for us at that point, we were like, okay, we know that we have like this little bubble of safety within this strategy. And so we decided to not file. It was important to me to like fill out the 1040 and like have that paper copy, but we just like, we're not going to engage at all with the IRS. And so we also did this with our state taxes. And we lived in 2 different states and had like very different experiences in each of those states. And the state that I'm currently live in has like, it has a very aggressive approach to people who don't pay their taxes. And so we've decided to just to pay the state taxes here in this state where we're living right now. But just in regards to state taxes, I think it's important to remember the connection of prisons to state violence and to war. And having, I think, more information about, and there's a ton of states, so like everything's different, but having I think resources around state taxes, especially now since abolition is a growing movement, could be really empowering for folks. So in 2018, I started getting really nervous about not filing. It just didn't feel good anymore. The tactic wasn't working for me. We had received like some random letters from the IRS to some random mailing addresses from our past. And I was like, oh, they're on to us. You know, I didn't have an understanding of like how impotent the IRS was at that time and that they just had like a tactic of intimidation, but, you know, and it worked. Right? It worked. I felt like I was on my heels and I had to like get ahead of them. And so, we talked with some folks from NWTRC, got some support and decided to come out. We were going to come clean and filed all of our back taxes in 1 year, like 3 days before the new year started, just get them all out. And had a CPA look over all of our paperwork and everything, and just did it. And then come the flood of certified letters. You know, here comes like the mail, the paperwork, the threats of liens, and just waiting for the other shoe to drop. You know, and it just, yeah, again, the basic intimidation strategy of the government. And I think at one point I called a lawyer because I was like so concerned, and he was like, well, you better set up a payment plan. And I was like, well, geez, like that's the opposite of what I want to do. I did all of this so I didn't have to pay. And so we've continued to not pay, but we're just filing now. And the IRS has garnished some of my wages. That's happened. And I survived it. And they might do it again. I don't know. But I would rather them steal money from me than willfully give it over to that leech of a federal government. So I'll let them do the work and come take it from my bank account or from my employer. Let them do the work. And so our strategy has shifted, you know, and I didn't really realize that that was something that was possible when I started doing tax resistance. I didn't realize that I could kind of adapt my resistance for the stage that I was in, either with my employment or even just like how I felt about the tactic in general. And it's been really helpful to talk with folks at NWTRC and get some information. Lincoln has been just like an incredible resource to my partner and me, and giving us a skinny on what's going on with the IRS, and helping us, I think, to feel even more empowered to continue with the strategy of resistance. So some thoughts about bringing in younger folks. So I would first of all say social media. It's big with the kids. And I would say even like specifically Instagram, although I'm not on Instagram, so I'm not like down with the kids, but having abbreviated, colorful content with really clear messaging is going to go a long way. I think that Nutric already has some really lovely zines, and I think getting those out to folks, especially like anti-fascists and anarchist folks who live and die by the zine, having it posted to the Anarchist Free Library, which is an awesome online resource where you can learn about all kinds of anarchist stuff, is a great place to sort of like continue the spread of information. I think that a lot of people rely on their tax return for survival. I think it's important to just realize that that's a reality for a lot of folks. And so having diverse strategies for resistance for people in diverse like class demographics, basically. I have been really encouraging my friends to file by paper, just to like weigh down the IRS. And I think it's just like fun. I think that's just like a really fun way to jam the system that really is, there's no risk at all. And you get to like really be an annoyance to the federal government. So why not? Fun, simple ways to do resistance like that, I think is really great and accessible for folks. And then again, just back to this idea of like networks of support, like what foundation do we have for folks to build off of? So if they are taking a risk, or you know, that safety net, right, that communal safety net, what do folks have to fall back on? We're asking people to really to take a personal financial risk in these really uncertain times. And so if there are ways that we can build confidence in each other and in the community that we've built, I think it's going to be more and more irresistible to do tax resistance. And it's kind of been said before, like just cross-pollination between like anti-war efforts and I would say specifically abolitionist and Black Lives Matter or Indigenous sovereignty movements. I'm hearing like younger activists talk more about like, oh, if we're going to be against the cops, then we also need to be against war. And that's making me realize like coming up through like a radical upbringing through the aughts, like it was really clear to me that the war was being brought home. Like I was seeing like really in real time, like the escalation and the militarization of the police. But now there's like a generations of folks who just see a militarized police and did not see that evolution, you know? And so there's like almost this coming back to understanding, oh, that like the war that we're seeing at home is also happening overseas, because there are generations of folks who have grown up with perpetual war, you know. So I think helping to make those connections is really helpful, and it's a great opportunity for co-education and collective strategy. And then lastly, I would just want folks to remember the real skepticism and fear of resisting the state that exists right now. I think especially like these younger generations have been brought up with increased surveillance, and there is just real fear about the consequences of resistance. A zine that I really like that helped make this really clear for me is called We Are All Very Anxious. And it talks about like the different stages of capitalism and the different ways that folks have been able to resist capitalism in its different stages. And now in our surveillance state of capitalism, like the major affect is fear. And so how are we supporting people in this state of collective fear to actually engage in resistance? And so I think that this just means like continued education about the potential consequences of war tax resistance. I think it means like more storytelling from folks who have actually engaged with war tax resistance. So I'm just going to try and practice this here right now today. And I think it helps build a sense of safety to see that there are people who are doing this like in real time and like not in jail, you know, not destitute because of the state. And again, I'm just going to really drive this home, building systems of support so people can continue to resist state oppression. And I think that that's just really integral to the sustainability of this tactic. And that's it for me. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you to Al and to Lindsay and to Jerry for all of your wonderful words and wisdom and experience. And I also think it's just each of you have three, kind of unique perspectives and unique ways of sharing information, which is wonderful and adds perspectives and ways of thinking that aren't that go beyond my own narrow view of that. So yeah, for right now, we'll open it up for questions. Again, with the way that we're recording, if you unmute yourself and have a question, we'll be able to hear you, but your video won't be recorded. Or if you'd rather just put something in the chat, either way works.
I could ask a question.
Sure.
Just for all of you, now I might have forgotten, but at what point or how long did it take you to find Newtrick? Or how did you find Newtrick along the way?
I don't remember exactly when I found Newtrick, but I think it was pretty early on in the process because I certainly couldn't have come up with all the stuff I came up with on my own. So I think it must have been fairly early in the process, which for me was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And also I'll just say that I think what kind of got me thinking about it and what led me to maybe look into that was a book that I've read it's disgraceful how many times I've read it, but it's called You Can Buy Happiness and It's Cheap. And it was written by someone who was part of the tiny house movement. And so she talked a lot about reducing the amount of time you spent doing work for wages, essentially, which really appeals to me.
And I don't remember the exact moment when I found Newtrick, but I knew about Newtrick because of my Catholic worker friends, which today is the 88th anniversary of the starting of that movement. So 88 radical years of awesomeness and awesome people, including Lincoln and Al and many other people on this call. But I remember the first time I began to actively start engaging in Newtrick around 2013. Well, 2013 was when I decided to become a war tax resistor. But before that, it was actually meeting Erica, who's on this call. And I don't remember where we met, but we met at some action. It might have been the SOAW.
It was SOA at the border, but I think we had been talking on Facebook here and there a little before that. So I knew I was going to run into you there.
Yeah, exactly. And so that was where I really started learning more. It was through Erica's witness.
And that's a direct result of our social media consultancy program. So yes, remember that in your budget decisions. Social media works.
Yeah, I think that I came across Newtrick I think I came across people who maybe were connected to NWTRC, maybe before I came across NWTRC as like an organization. But yeah, I would say early on in my resistance, and didn't really engage for a long time, like after we had kind of found a tactic that worked for us. And then when we shifted, like leaned very heavily on the knowledge of this group and resources. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. It's helpful for us too. Great question. Other questions from the group?
Yeah, hi. I'm Orlando, and it's great to see meet the three of you and your presentation this morning. And I want to thank you all for your eloquence. Yesterday, this is one of my first times having a Zoom meeting, and certainly the first time I know two other people who are here. But in terms of National War Tax Resistors, this is the first time I've met a group of people from across the country like this. And I think there's a tremendous thing that isn't happening between the generations that holds a lot of potential. I view myself as a member of the younger generation in America, except 50 years has gone by since we became very dedicated activists in regards to civil rights and Vietnam and a whole lot of things that we see resurfacing in a very discouraging, conflictual way, again in the United States coming to the fore. But I think that between the young adults and we who are now the elders in every family, the elders in every profession, every walk of life, you know, no matter what our gender or skin color or any of that, those of us who are all united by being sane citizens and having, you know, expectations about democracy and voting. I guess I'd like to ask if you're finding the kind of support and connections with we who are now retirement age, you who are still coming into activism as we did much earlier in life, and amongst your peers, you know, your generational peers, shall we say?
I take inspiration from the folks in this group, and I also think that when I have reached out to people, people have been very helpful, very warm, and very welcoming to me, which I found very encouraging. When you started to ask your question, I thought of another intergenerational issue, which is where I thought you were going when you started, but I'll just mention that I've been surprised personally that, especially given where I grew up and the circles that I've traveled in, that more people who are older than me have not mentioned this type of resistance. I mean, I'm not Quaker, but I worked for several years with people who are Quakers in some activist movements. Even though I grew up in Western Mass, which is a home to a number of very prominent war tax resistors, it, you know, maybe by osmosis, it seeped in over all those years, but it was not something that a lot of people who would be like my parents' age or older have ever mentioned to me. And then when I've gone and done research, I've been surprised to find out that some people I knew were involved in that. And I kind of wish they had spoken up and said something to me maybe earlier, because yeah, I think it's worth mentioning.
I have probably found most of the opposition from quote unquote elders. There's a generation or two of folks who that, like, For instance, my grandparents who went through the Great Depression and things like that, and who saw economic instability. And so their consciousness was formed, I think, out of trauma, that you should do whatever you can to make as much money as you can so that you can always be safe. And I just don't know. And then so I have a multi-generational family in my house. So my father is a boomer, my mother is a Gen Xer, and my brother and I are both quote unquote millennials. And we all have completely different views on everything. It is quite amazing. But my father definitely comes from that place of you need to go to work 9 to 5 every day. You need to come home tired. You need to make as much money as you can so that you can retire one day and do nothing but golf and all that stuff, which is incredibly boring and exhausting just thinking about it. My mother and I are kind of similar in the fact that we don't really believe in retirement. We kind of think that's like a white people thing that they invented to enjoy privilege for the rest of your life. And we also just think it's very boring. But we differ in the fact that I don't think money as it is today stretches as far as it may have been in the past. And I also don't think it will last much longer. I think we're starting to have to force ourselves to reimagine how we use money, what money is, and what a value that we give to it. And so to be totally honest and frank, I look to elders as witnesses, particularly those who I know who have done great work in the past and who are still doing that life and living that witness, even if they've compromised a little bit from here or there. But I don't really look for insight or direction necessarily. I look really more for stories, because I don't necessarily think that if there is wisdom, not all of it is applicable to this current time, because we're just living into newer realities around economics and social relatability and social location and all of that jazz. I also don't think things are resurfacing. I think they're just they've always continued. They just have different names now. They're rebranded.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. Yeah, I think, in regards to like looking to elders for support and affirmation around war tax resistance, yeah, I think that's really valuable. And I think that that's like one of the values of NWTRC, that it's providing a space for people to be seen and heard in practicing the strategy. I think like what Jerry was kind of saying, like I would say, we are in a certain stage of collapse, and so the relationship to, like Jerry was saying, like the relationship to money is really quite different, I think, for folks my generation. Like I do have like a 403b. We'll see if I'll get to use that in like 40 years. I don't know. So there's like a different kind of I think we're having to be more creative about how we talk about sustainability and planning for our future, like collectively. And climate collapse also, like when I say collapse, I'm talking about collapse of capitalism, collapse of the American empire, collapse of the climate, like, and I think that that's like a reality that a lot of younger folks are just like living with on a daily basis, like that actual like trauma of seeing that this world, that this home is in a state of incredible decline. So yeah, and I think like a difference that I experience also is in being an anarchist, and so not necessarily believing in the sanctity of democracy, you know, or the power of the vote. I'm pretty dissuaded from that, and I tend to roll with people who feel similarly. So I think that that's I would say I'm seeing more disaffected political perspectives among younger people, but that also might just be like who I hang out with. So, you know, who knows?
Thank you.
Al mentioned fear just now, and you know, that 403B and whether you're going to get to use it or not. And I just wanted to echo and amplify that. I think that is a real concern for people under the age of 40. I was taught from a very young age to start a retirement account by, you know, my lovely grandmother and uncle, and I'm very thankful to them. And even though that account has grown in leaps and bounds, which I'm not entirely comfortable with, and is something that I continue to explore as a source of frustration and definitely difficult morals. Even though it's grown, I feel a lot of fear about what that world will look like and whether I will be safe and taken care of then. And that's actually part of the reason that I started doing things like delivering for Meals on Wheels and joining the time trade here in my community to try and engage in building that like culture of care, because I don't have a lot of confidence in the future, unfortunately. And so I figure the money might not be there, but hopefully at least I can connect with people who won't let me, like, you know, die in a ditch or something awful. Try and create, and that I would do the same for them and make sure that we're taken care of, because I don't have a lot of faith in money and the systems that are built around it at this point.
Thank you for sharing your very thoughtful answers to that question. And now Susan's had her hand up for a little while, so I'll let you ask your question.
Hey, everybody. It's fun seeing new faces. I used to come to NWTRC meetings all the time, back when I might have looked a little more like you. And it's like, okay, this is reminding me of the good old days when I really was doing a lot of outreach, and I was concerned with inviting people into the war tax resistance movement. And, you know, I can't even imagine how many workshops I've organized and, you know, newsletters I've worked on and all that. And so one question is just, is that something that the three of you are engaged in doing right now? Are you actively inviting people into the war tax resistance movement? Because honestly, I'm not, other than by witness. I think that's where I've fallen back. It's just like, I'm a war tax resistor, you know, People's Life Fund, we redirect money, that, you know, that has a certain amount of visibility, but I no longer intentionally, you know, try to sort of recruit people. It's more like just be here if somebody feels, you know, they feel thirsty and you've got some water, so they come and ask for some water. It's like, yes, here's some water, you know, great. But I'm not running around telling people to drink more water. So I'm wondering, is anybody doing that? Are people actively working on outreach to young people?
Well, I know I'm involved in reaching out. I'm fortunate to have two sisters who are quite a bit younger than me. I think they're both technically part of the same generation, but certainly doesn't seem that way most of the time. And they have friends, and I talk pretty openly about the things that I'm involved in, and we're big fans in our family of, we'll call it debating, but arguing. So I do engage in a lot of that with them. I share my opinions on social media. I'm not the world's most prolific social media poster. And on later, now it's this month, I'll be tabling and sharing information that way. I've put up tables in front of my house to share information. So I live in a very liberal community, so that feels pretty safe to do. I don't know that other people would necessarily feel the same way where they live, but for me, that's very important to how I live my life, is sharing the information and inviting people to join me as much as they are able.
Go ahead. No, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I have been really quiet about my own personal resistance, just out of fear of repression, I guess, and because I didn't understand entirely what the consequences of my resistance would be, and so I really felt like I needed to protect myself by being silent. So I'm a little more willing now to share like my experience, obviously, I guess. And actually, like, in preparation for this, I reached out to some like young radicals, and I was like, hey, what kind of questions, do you have about war tax resistance? I'm gonna like speak to this group. And they're like, what? You cannot pay your taxes? And I was like, oh, let me tell you. And they were just like blown away, and like immediately found NWTRC website and were like reading through stuff. And so I think there is like a hunger, and I am interested in getting my community to stop paying taxes, and I think it just means like another personal risk of being seen, like being more public about it, and I think I'm more willing to do that now than I was maybe 10 years ago.
A couple of years ago, I was at a nonviolence trainers gathering, and I was talking to Joanne Sheehan, a longtime Harvard worker, activist, and awesome human being. And I don't remember what we were talking about, but I made this comment to her that I never want to live my life in such a way to where people forget about me. Right. And Joanne just started laughing as all can be. And she's like, Jerry, you are a lot of things, but not being memorable is, that's not a thing for you. You're always very memorable. Like anybody who meets you will always remember who you are. And so I mentioned that just to make people laugh, because I think laughter is important and it's a form of resistance. It's good to not take ourselves too seriously. But also too, because of what Lindsay and Al have said, in that this idea of remembering each other and having some other people remember us. I think that's kind of the consciousness that I come at my activism with. I live in Texas. It's one of the worst states in the union. And so because of that, I have the opportunity on a daily basis to show up in places where people like me probably would not normally be. And because of that, I can oftentimes say, well, that $5 you just spent on your coffee, you could take that $5 and actually give it to somebody who would benefit from it. Like you can give it to this organization. I always have a bag with me, and it's always filled with pamphlets. So I might give them something, or when I go to when I'm downtown, we have a bunch of banks downtown. I might go into the bank and leave some pamphlets on the table or give it to a bank teller. or when I talk to officers, I sometimes, which I very rarely do because I have a policy of not talking to officers. But if I find myself in a situation where I have to talk to an officer, I might say, you could hope to stop police brutality and completely stop all this chaos by quitting the police and giving all of the money that you have to peace organizations and all that. So anyway, my point of it is I try to do it consciously by going to places where that message would be so jarring to people that it actually would force them to think about it.
Thank you for sharing how some ways you've disseminated war tax resistance information in your lives. I see we have a question where someone's wanting to, I'll just read it. So how familiar are you with the War Tax Resistance Penalty Fund and alternative funds and their roles in supporting war tax resistance? Do these funds relieve some of your fear around war tax resistance?
I'm a little familiar. I think that that's something I think when we were deciding to file, I think we learned about these funds. Yeah, which is I think it is like a bit of a cushion, right? It is, I think, like a communal, and it's community care, right? Yeah, I think for me, I think another piece of the fear, it's not just like, are they going to take all my money, but it's just like the fear of like being seen and known by the government as a resistor, so it's not necessarily always the dollar amount, but it's being known, right? And like the government has all kinds of information on us, and to be sort of like highlighted in that way. So but yeah, I think that the fund is really integral to that piece of support, and I think is a great model of mutual aid and care.
I would agree. I'm aware of it. When I started to do the research about this, I read everything that I could find on the website, and so that's probably where I came upon the information about the penalty fund. And I did find that reassuring, though I'm in the position where I don't know that I would necessarily need to call upon the fund. I'm fortunate to have a partner and a financial situation that would probably allow me to take on that burden myself, which probably makes me think that I should be contributing to the fund for folks who aren't, especially like, Al mentioned earlier, not, I'm definitely coming from a place of privilege with that, and that's not the situation for everybody. So I am aware, and it was helpful to know that there were people who would care enough about me paying those penalties to help me pay those penalties.
I know about them, and I encourage people often to donate to them so that there's money in there to support people. I don't normally, I'm not in a situation where I feel like I need to rely on them. Not because I have a lot of money or access to a lot of money, but because I think my fear around war tax resistance is not the government knowing about me, because I am almost 100% sure that they know about me. Again, memorable. That's the theme here, y'all. And but I am banned from 12 military bases, for crossing the line and doing things like that. So I'm sure they know about me, and I'm sure they have a huge file. And in fact, I hope one day to see it. And my fear, I think, is really more about being abandoned, being in a situation where because I took a moral stand to live a certain way, to be integral, that I know that there are people in the world who are not like that and who would use that against you, right? To use your integrity against you, because you're not. There's this idea like you have to get a, you know, you have to play the game, right? There's a lot of people out there who believe you got to play the game. Even if you don't like it, you got to play it, and you got to learn to play it well so that you can survive. And I just don't buy into that. I think that the prophets of old and the great activists of this land, and including indigenous people and things like that, have taught us that that's not why we're here in this planet. My indigenous heritage teaches me that we are guests in this realm, and we are guests here with a purpose. We were sent here to do good and to live in a good way, so that when the Great Spirit comes back for us, we have left this place a little bit better. And so my fear, I think, is if I chose to live that way, which I do every day, that one day something might happen and I might be completely abandoned. So that's why I work actively to try to build relationships, to try to know stories, to try to show up for people and make it clear and plain and horizontal as can be that I am for you and you and I would like you to be for me. And together we can co-liberate one another and also have much more fun, which is important to resistance.
I'd like to just, go ahead, Lindsay, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Since the word fear was mentioned and a couple people brought that up, I also, you know, relating back to the question about how much I share with other people and try and bring them in, I do share a lot with people that every time I've let go of fear, I've found that my life has gotten better. And so taking on more tax resistance was very scary for me. I grew up, you pay taxes. This is what you do. You fill out forms, you pay taxes. But I do try and share with people that when I've let go of those fears, it has, as Jerry said, been liberating. And I hope it's liberating for other people to know that that has been the way I've found it to be.
Another thought just about the fund, and I think that this is just like a certain discomfort that I have with it, right? Is like, I'm a war tax resistor. I don't want to contribute to a fund that's going to like go to the federal government, you know? And understanding, like, similarly, that it is a means of protection for people who are taking that risk. And I guess after doing some like mutual aid organizing this year, have been thinking about like ways that we can be meeting people's needs with like in roundabout and creative ways, right? And so so my curiosity about the fund is like, well, if my neighbor, if my comrade, if my co-resistor has the IRS like breathing down their neck, are there other means of support? Like, do they need just like help paying their rent, you know, rather than paying the federal government? Like, do they need help getting groceries rather than paying the federal government? And if there are other like workarounds and other kinds of ways that we can support people who are doing resistance without paying the federal government to sort of like buy the end of the harassment. So that's I think that's another thought that I have about the fund in general.
Still have a little time left. Other questions for our panelists today?
Do you have any questions?
Just a response, and Peter, you can correct me about this if I'm wrong, but my understanding, and of course I've been a part of the War Tax Resistors Penalty Fund since way back at the beginning and other iterations of it, but my understanding is that the request doesn't go out to people until after the war tax resistor has actually already been done and seized by the IRS. So at that point, the IRS is already getting its money. And what we're doing in the War Tax Resistors Penalty Fund is simply reimbursing the war tax resistor for what has been stolen from them. So I've always felt good about it. And in fact, I've made use of it over the last 40 years, numerous times. In fact, I can attest to the fact that if you're smart about this and make use of all the mutual aid that we provide to each other, your war tax resistance doesn't have to cost you anything financially, even if the IRS does collect from you.
Thanks for that clarification. I appreciate that.
And we really do encourage people to use it because it helps the people who are in the network, who are supporting the fund, to see faces of people who are resisting, and it helps them to feel like they're part of something more than just a thing. So I even though you don't need it, it's worthwhile using it to help with the other people who are trying to do what they can for resistance.
I think it's probably also something that's going back to my presentation about how people can get involved, like after college and maybe having debt, that this is something that NWTRC and the fund could explore as being a way to help get people maybe started down this path, is by being an ally to folks who have had that money taken from them.
Yes, thank you for that clarification, Robert and Peter. And yeah, I guess I'll throw out a question. So, I guess maybe first with a comment that looking at my understanding of the history of NWTRC when it started in 1982, you had a lot of active local groups. Now, there are some active local groups, like there's still technically a Milwaukee War Tax Resistance where I am, but it's not very active. And, so I think that sense of community perhaps, or how people would find out about war tax resistance I get the sense it'd be different today than it was back when NWTRC first started. And also, so there's that aspect of how most people find out about NWTRC, or maybe that's how they find out about war tax resistance, maybe on the internet, or someone tells them. They're not told like, hey, come to our local group and we'll tell you about it. So there's kind of a different emphasis of how people get those resources. The other thing that I wanted to share is, the last year and a half, we had a few focus groups with activists in their 20s who weren't previously familiar with war tax resistance. And I think similar to what many of you shared, we'd asked them at the beginning kind of what their initial thoughts were about war tax resistance before we've talked about it at all. And I'd say it was more like neutral to perhaps negative. And is kind of thought, well, I think those groups are probably more like holier than thou. But then after it was a 6-hour session. So just as a reminder, we did pay them a stipend. And so it was 6 hours over 2 weeks. And at the end, we'd asked the same question and their opinion had changed. And many of them were thinking about it. And many of them have now been added to our newsletter e-list. And, so I guess it's how to break through. So this is where I don't know the answer, because I think there is a thirst. I think there are young people that would be interested. But I also know if I contact 350.org and say, hey, let's try to do something together. And would you be willing to have someone just say 5 minutes about war tax resistance at some event? I'm going to be told no. So maybe focusing on someone had mentioned abolition, like groups that are more willing to break the law and do civil disobedience is perhaps a way, but just kind of curious looking at that picture, what your thoughts are.
Well, I have paperwork sitting next to me that was sent from another resistor who's often in these sessions, of names of people who were previously involved in an active local group in this area. And they sent me that information because I expressed interest in revitalizing that. And so I think that having active local groups would be an enormous assistance to people who are looking to get involved, because I think perhaps especially after the pandemic, people are looking for connection with folks. And so that's a way to do that. And so, I'm looking forward to trying to do that more in our area. And oh gosh, you said something at the end there, Lincoln, and now I've forgotten what you said.
Perhaps it was about in like a group like 350, like our local 350
yeah.
group is not interested.
I actually think that that's not the case at all. As someone who's particularly been involved with 350 groups, the 350 Vermont and 350 Brattleboro groups that I'm involved with do a lot of solidarity. And I think that a lot of the people who are involved in those groups are interested in this sort of thing. And when I was in 350 Philadelphia, I would say similar. I can't really speak to the national organization, but one thing that is important, since you use 350 as your example, I'll just say that one thing that's important to remember about that group in particular is that it is totally diffuse. There isn't really a 350, so to speak. The groups are very independent and have very different ways of operating. And I'm of the mind that if you don't ask, then you can't be told yes. So, I am interested in building the local network here, and I see opportunities for that in part because I live perhaps in an area that's more receptive to that. But I also think that trying to build those connections is partly about offering things, not just asking for things. So when we look to lend our solidarity with movements, we need to offer something. So maybe it's, manning the discussion on the Facebook page and making sure that it stays civil, or offering food for an event. And then, it is a little bit quid pro quo, but I don't know that there's anything wrong with that when we have something really good and important to say that might be valuable to people.
I've tried to share this tactic with folks before, and they're like, maybe you shouldn't be talking about this, as a security culture kind of thing. Like, don't talk about the illegal things that you're doing. I think, I think that that's just demonstrative of maybe the lack of knowledge of the risk that's being taken. I think that maybe the folks that I run with are maybe hyper vigilant about avoiding risk and exposure to risk. And then what was the other thing that I was going to say to that? Yeah, I think that folks who I think that folks who are working towards abolition and that ground, it's a really fertile opportunity for demonstrating that there are ways to actively resist the war machine and state violence, I would say, is the term that I would use.
I can move on to unless you had something, Jerry, I can move on to the next question. All right. So there is a question in the chat, and then I'll get to Anne's question. So someone stated, my objective for war tax resistance is not to keep my tax money from the government, but to reduce US militarism and to redirect US spending from war to social justice. I'd be interested to hear your comments.
I think that's a nice play of words, but I think it's dishonest, or it's not accurate, because we are keeping our money from the government because they are the ones that do all of that stuff. And so I think it's good to, again, make all things plain and clear and concise. And yes, we are in a sense breaking the law. But I think from my vantage point as a person of faith and an ordained person, I say it's because I am following a higher law, which calls me to live in right relationship with all of creation, including my other siblings. And that means that I have to work to make sure that every person and every creature has life and has it abundantly. And I don't mean that in the sense of that you have a whole bunch of stuff, but that you have exactly everything that you need to be who you are supposed to be in the earth. So yes, I am keeping my money from the government, and I hope it crumbles.
So I would be more in line with the question asker in that I would agree my objective isn't really to keep my money from the government, but to reduce militarism. I've worked a lot of government jobs, and I have a degree in regional planning, and I don't like almost anything that our government does in a lot of situations, but I personally see value in having a government. And so I would be of the mind that I would be okay with my money going to the government if they did exactly the types of things I'd like them to do. It just happens that they don't, and so I can't give them all my money that they want.
Yeah, I would say that the US government is entrenched in white supremacy, settler colonialism, and profits off of oppression. So I do not trust it to do good by its people. So I don't want to contribute money to it.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we can see there also some of the views on government. You can have different views on government and still come to war tax resistance. So Anne had a comment, so I'll leave it over to Anne.
Yeah, I was coming back to when we were talking about outreach to other groups, and I love this idea of doing mutual support, for other groups, taking on responsibilities to build those relationships. But I was wondering about, so for instance, while 350.org may not be open to this idea of promoting war tax resistance or taking it on as a strategy, I think that actually might change in the future. And I'm thinking of Veterans for Peace, which has a lot of war tax resistors. And a couple of them are actually in our network, but I don't often see them at our meetings. But Veterans for Peace has been making strong coalition with 350.org in different states and different cities, and carrying that message, right, of war tax resistance as a way of defunding the military and then promoting the environment. So I was just wondering, folks in your communities, as you're out there, are you interacting with these groups like Veterans for Peace, talking about war tax resistance, and 350.org? I know the Sunrise Movement here in San Diego has begun to talk about it. And definitely the Black Lives Matter movement has drawn attention to how, national priorities and how we spend our money on prisons instead of schools. So all good conversations for sure.
Well, I would say I'm very, very, very well connected with Veterans for Peace. I used to do some work for them, particularly around border justice issues, and I know a lot of their board and their staff, and I chat with them regularly. In fact, the woman who manages my website is a part of their staff, and so helping to try to make sure people get money wherever they can on that. And I think, kind of to that point of what Anne brought up is one of the reasons why I think it's hard for us to kind of share consciousness around war tax resistance with other groups is because our peace movement and the anti-war movement is so siloed into the nonprofit industrial complex that we come at this in very specific ways, which I don't necessarily think is bad, but I think it's short-sighted. So if we were able to, I think we kind of have to have nonprofits in some sense. But I think if we try to learn to recognize that we might have a specific lane that we drive in, that there's more than one route to get to the same destination, right? And try to get a much more of a shared culture around a diversity of tactics or a diversity of understanding of mission, I guess you could say. So that would be my 2 cents on the topic.
Here we can we'll move on. So Alex has a question. I think with our time factor, the way we'll do this is Alex can ask the question, and then you can either respond to Alex and maybe have any closing words, or however you want to do it, but we'll kind of view this as the final round. So on to you, Alex. You're muted. You're muted.
All right, here I go. I'm Alex Walker. I've been a member of NWTRCC for a few years now, and I've gotten in trouble for doing this kind of thing. I'm probably going to do it again. So, but anyway, nevertheless, a couple of people in this discussion recommended that we use Facebook and other social media in order to broaden our appeals. Well, I have a couple of issues with that. Number one, first and foremost, the algorithms of Facebook, I know for a fact, and I think Twitter also, always favor the meanest, nastiest, most violent, most angry people, voices. Which means if you go in and you talk about nonviolent resistance to what all these bad things that the government is doing, you're going to run up against the cancel culture, and people will say that you're just a mouthpiece for the white, so-called white supremacist, blah, blah, blah. And everybody again is assuming that, everyone here seems to assume that all the Black Lives Matter people and so forth are all angels who believe in nonviolence and inspired by Martin Luther King. Actually, their inspiration is Malcolm X, who says that you never get anything of a revolution with blood. It's about land and bloodshed. Now, the reason I'm trying to make this point is you have to, if you're going to go to social media, I want to emphasize the fact that you have to word what you're saying just right so that you don't run up against the cancel culture and you try to make our point, which is that war tax resistance really is a serious thing, a serious tactic to bring about social change. And I would like somebody to comment on that.
Sure. So let's just, since I see Orlando also has a hand up, how about you can quickly ask your question and then we'll leave it to the panel to how they want to answer these questions.
Thanks. I'm not sure if I had a question. I wanted to throw out was that we all are involved with other organizations and other, or not all, but certainly there's other activities, and war tax resistance has been a very personal part of my own conscience. Though, again, there's the vulnerability that comes with that. Having never had an intention of being a martyr, I think is an important thing. Catholic workers have been around for a long time in the Northwest. I don't know directly, but my friends, my long-term friends, are very close to the people who went into the missile base some years ago and hammered on nuclear warheads. Whoops, Zoom conked out there. Am I back? Nod somebody.
Yeah, we can hear you. You never went out.
Okay, so this morning, before this session started, I was again live with a broadcast that had Edward Snowden, Amy Goodman, and Dan Ellsberg live in a conference out of UMass. And to me, those three people are contemporary, still alive heroes. So they make some sort of giants of people that we all in the movement over the years have known their names when they stuck their necks out very publicly. I guess I just want to leave it with everybody who's here today, who's participated, as you know, for at least sticking our necks out privately without wanting to have them chopped off, so that we can continue doing whatever other things that we do to try to move the agenda for peace, justice, etc., and so forth forward. As happy to see all the different younger generations, and now that some of us find ourselves, much to our chagrin, still alive in the older generation, you know, here we are, alive today. Okay, I'll leave it there.
All right, so I'll leave it off to our panel for that last comment and Alex's question about social media use.
I think that the role of social media with Nutric is probably more in commenting, responding, and inserting to other conversations that are ongoing. I don't know how important it is to actually draw people to.
Did what I say make any sense?
To follow Nutric, for example, on Twitter or Facebook or something like that. I think it's more about inserting into the conversation and offering a solution for people and a tactic with that toolbox. And I do think that's valuable to do, and is probably worth the time, though I honestly think that it's more about building relationships that are ongoing with people. I'm not sure that this is something that people are going to take on because they heard about it on social media. I think it requires more than that. And definitely building those relationships over time.
So I have a lot of I have a lot of comments that I could say about what has been said. I love it when people take up a lot of space, and so I'm going to demonstrate how you not do that by not answering what has been said.
I am going to say that if we want younger people to be doing war tax resistance, we need to show up where they are, and they are on social media. And so that doesn't mean that we have to be trying to build a giant platform, but we have to be where they are so we can receive them when they're curious. And so social media is one of those places. It is a toxic place. It is evil. It is for profit. And when the service is free, you are the service, all of that. So we know that. And I think that there are smart, humble ways to maintain a presence, to be able to receive people who are ready for this tactic. That's what I think about that.
Right, and we'll bring our panel to a close, and I think I speak for all of us in thanking Al and Jerry and Lindsay for all of your wonderful words. And if people weren't muted, you'd be hearing lots of clapping right now. And but yes, thank you so much. Each of your experiences and insights and personal witness, and you know, to see how you've lived into your activism and lived into your war tax resistance has been inspirational and wonderful. And it's one of the joys of being the Nutric coordinator is getting to, you know, you guys will call me sometimes and then I get to chat. And so it's definitely a pleasure. Without Nutric, I wouldn't know who any of you are.